I trusted my sister when she handed me those allergy pills. Take 2 before bed, Elise said with a sweet smile. You need rest before your long drive to Grandpa's will reading tomorrow. 20 minutes later, I was on my kitchen floor, throat closing, vision dissolving into black, my heartbeat pounding so loud it echoed through my skull like a drum. She switched the labels. My own sister had poisoned me. I crawled toward my phone and dialed 911 before everything went dark. 4 days later, I walked into that will, reading the one Elise thought I'd never survive to attend. The room went dead silent. My parents' mouths fell open. Elise's face turned the color of ash, but that wasn't the moment that shattered everything. It was when 2 police officers stepped through the door and said, "Which one of you is Elise Price? We have questions about a federal investigation." What they revealed next made my mother's hand fly to her mouth. My father's coffee cup slipped from his fingers and exploded on the marble floor. Have you ever discovered that someone you loved your whole life had been secretly destroying you all along? My name is Lauren Price. I'm 35 years old, and I've spent the last decade working as an accountant in a small Indiana town where everyone knows your name, but nobody really sees you. I have built what I thought was a stable, independent life, but looking back now, I realize I was living in a house of cards that my own family had been secretly dismantling for years. That Thursday afternoon started like any other. I was finishing up quarterly reports at my desk when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end belonged to Mr. Hendricks, my grandfather's attorney. Grandpa Harold had passed away 2 weeks earlier, and the will reading was scheduled for Monday morning. But there was something unusual about the call. Mr. Hendricks said that Grandpa had left a special sealed portion of the will that could only be opened if I was physically present. Not my parents, not my sister Elise. Me, specifically. I remember feeling a strange warmth spread through my chest. In a family where I had always been the afterthought, Grandpa Harold had singled me out. He was the only one who ever really saw me. 2 months before he died, he called me out of the blue, asking odd questions about my finances. Had I checked my credit report lately? Was I having trouble with loans? I laughed it off, telling him everything was fine, even though it wasn't. The truth was, my credit score had been mysteriously destroyed for years. I'd been rejected for home loans 3 times. I couldn't understand why I paid my bills on time. I had no debt that I knew of. I did everything right. But the banks kept saying no, and I kept blaming myself for some invisible mistake I couldn't identify. During that last phone call, Grandpa mentioned my grandmother Eleanor's name and then paused for a long moment as if he wanted to tell me something important. But he changed the subject, and I was too distracted to press him. I wish now that I had listened more carefully. Grandma Eleanor died 5 years ago, and the wound still hasn't healed. She was the one who used to braid my hair when I was little, who called me her brave girl, who made me feel like I mattered. When she passed, I waited for a letter, a keepsake, anything that might carry her love forward. But nothing came. Elise handled the estate and told me Grandma wasn't sentimental about material things. I accepted that explanation, even though it broke my heart. A few months later, I noticed Elise wearing a beautiful pearl necklace I'd never seen before. When I asked about it, she said she bought it at an estate sale. I believed her. Why wouldn't I believe my own sister? Within an hour of the attorney's call, Elise phoned me, with a sweetness that felt almost performative. She asked what time I was leaving for the will reading, which route I planned to take, whether I was feeling well enough for the long drive. She seemed particularly interested in my seasonal allergies, which had been acting up all week. Looking back, I can see the calculation behind every question. But at the time, I just thought she was being unusually caring. That evening, I was settling in for a quiet night when my phone buzzed with a text from Elise. She was stopping by with some new allergy medicine, she said. She wanted me well rested for the long drive Monday. I smiled at the message, touched by what I thought was sisterly concern. I had a security camera system installed after a break-in 2 years ago, and I watched on the monitor as her car pulled into my driveway. As I unlocked the door to welcome her, I had no idea that Elise had spent the last 8 years systematically destroying my life from the shadows. And tonight she was about to repeat a crime she had successfully committed 5 years ago, one that had already stolen my grandmother's final words from me forever. Elise stepped through my door that Thursday evening with a warm smile and a small white pharmacy bag in her hand. She looked every bit the concerned younger sister, her voice soft and caring, as she pressed the bag into my palm. "These are stronger than your usual brand," she said. "Take 2 before bed and you'll sleep like a baby. You need your rest before that long drive Monday." I noticed her eyes flick toward the security camera mounted in the corner of my living room, but I thought nothing of it. Maybe she was just curious about my home security setup. She hugged me before she left, and the embrace lasted longer than usual. I remember thinking how nice it was that we were finally getting closer. I had spent so many years feeling like the outsider in my own family, and here was my sister showing up with medicine and genuine concern. I thanked her and watched her taillights disappear down my quiet street. I took the pills exactly as she instructed. 2 small tablets with a glass of water, then I settled onto my couch to watch television. The evening news droned on about local politics and weather forecasts. I pulled a blanket over my legs and waited for the drowsiness to come. Instead, something else happened. About 20 minutes after I swallowed those pills, my throat began to tighten. At first, I thought it was just my allergies acting up again. Maybe some dust I had stirred up while cleaning. But then the tightness turned into pressure, like invisible hands squeezing my windpipe. My vision blurred at the edges. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, beating wildly and irregularly like it had forgotten its own rhythm. This was not allergies. This was not a side effect. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. I tried to stand, but my legs gave out beneath me. I crashed to the floor, knocking over the lamp on my side table. The room spun around me in sickening circles. I knew with sudden clarity that I was going into anaphylactic shock. Those pills were not allergy medicine. My sister had given me something designed to shut my body down. I could feel my airway closing, each breath becoming a desperate fight for the smallest sip of oxygen. My phone was on the coffee table just a few feet away, but it might as well have been miles. I dragged myself across the carpet, my arms trembling, my vision going dark at the edges. I reached up and knocked the phone to the floor, then fumbled with shaking fingers until I managed to dial 911. When the operator answered, I could barely speak. I gasped out my address in broken fragments, each word costing me precious air. Then everything went black. I learned later that my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, saved my life. She is 67 years old, a retired school teacher who lives alone in the house next door. She heard the ambulance sirens and came running over in her bathrobe and slippers. The paramedics found me unconscious on my living room floor, barely breathing, my lips turning blue. Mrs. Patterson held my hand while they worked on me, and she rode with me in the ambulance to the hospital. She stayed in the waiting room all night, refusing to leave until she knew I would survive. I woke up in the intensive care unit on Friday morning with tubes in my arms and an oxygen mask on my face. A nurse told me I had arrived just in time. Another 10 minutes, and I would have been beyond saving. That afternoon, a woman in a dark blazer walked into my hospital room and introduced herself as Detective Martinez. She asked if I felt well enough to answer some questions about my sister Elise. I nodded, my throat still raw and sore. What she told me next shattered everything I thought I knew about my own life. Elise had been under federal investigation for identity theft for the past 6 months. The victim was me. Over the course of 8 years, someone had opened 7 credit accounts in my name and racked up $187,000 in fraudulent debt. That someone was my own sister. The mysterious credit problems that had haunted me for years, the loan rejections, the constant financial humiliation, all of it traced back to Elise. She had been stealing my identity and destroying my future while smiling at me across the Thanksgiving table. I could have crumbled in that moment. Part of me wanted to. But something else rose up inside me instead, something harder and more determined. I asked Detective Martinez to hand me the hospital phone. My first call was to my cloud storage provider. I changed the password on my security camera footage and locked it down so that no one could access or delete it. That footage showed Elise entering my home with the pills. It showed her glancing at the camera. It showed her handing me the poison with a sister's smile. My second call was to the credit bureaus. I requested emergency freezes on all 3 of my credit files. No one would open another account in my name ever again. Then I turned back to Detective Martinez and asked her for copies of every document in the investigation file. I was done being a passive victim. If my sister had been destroying my life for 8 years, I was going to understand exactly how she did it. As I reviewed the police timeline from my hospital bed, one detail made my blood run cold. The earliest fraudulent account was opened just 3 months after my grandmother Eleanor died. That was right after Elise handled the estate, right after she told me Grandma was not sentimental and left me nothing. Detective Martinez noticed my expression and leaned forward. Identity thieves often escalate after getting away with something smaller, she said. They gain confidence. They push further. I stared at the document in my hands and felt a terrible question forming in my mind. If Elise started stealing my identity right after handling Grandma's estate, what else did she take from me back then? What else disappeared that I never knew was meant to be mine? I spent the weekend recovering in that hospital room, my body slowly healing, while my mind raced through every memory I had of my sister. Every kind gesture now looked different. Every sweet word now sounded hollow. On Sunday evening, my hospital phone rang. It was Mr. Hendrick's grandfather, Harold's attorney. He told me the will reading was still scheduled for Monday morning exactly as my grandfather had requested, but there was something else. Harold had left unusual instructions. A private nurse named Margaret would deliver something to me Monday morning just before the reading. She would arrive at 7 o'clock sharp. Mr. Hendricks did not know what the delivery contained, only that Harold had been very specific about the timing and the recipient. It had to be me, and it had to be that morning. I hung up the phone and stared at the ceiling tiles above my hospital bed. My grandfather had known. Somehow, impossibly, he had known that something like this might happen. He had prepared for it. He had left instructions and made arrangements that would only activate if I ended up exactly where I was right now. The question that kept me awake all night was simple but terrifying. What did Grandpa Harold discover before he died, and what was Margaret bringing me that he did not trust anyone else to deliver? The answer came at 7 o'clock Monday morning. I had been discharged from the hospital 30 minutes earlier, still weak, but determined to make it to the will reading. I was sitting in the lobby waiting for my cab when a woman in her 60s approached me with gentle eyes and a worn leather bag over her shoulder. She introduced herself as Margaret, and she said she had been my grandfather's private hospice nurse during his final 6 months. Harold had given her very specific instructions. If anything ever happened to me, if I ever ended up in a hospital or in any kind of trouble, she was to deliver 2 items directly into my hands and no one else's. She reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive and a sealed envelope with my name written on it in my grandfather's shaky handwriting. I opened the envelope first. Inside was a note that made my breath catch in my throat. My brave girl, it read, "If you are reading this, I was right to worry. Watch the video before you face them. And know this, your grandmother never forgot you. What Elise took from you 5 years ago, I have done my best to return." I stared at those words until they blurred through my tears. Margaret squeezed my shoulder and told me there was a quiet room down the hall where I could watch the video in private. She walked me there and stood guard outside the door while I inserted the USB into my laptop. My grandfather's face appeared on the screen, and even though I knew he was gone, seeing him alive again hit me like a physical blow. He looked frail, propped up against pillows in what must have been his hospice bed, but his eyes were fierce and clear. He spoke directly to the camera as if he could see me watching from the future. "Lauren," he said, 6 months ago, I was going through your grandmother Eleanor's belongings. I found her personal diary hidden in a box of old photographs. The last entry was written the week before she died." He paused, and I could see his hands trembling as he held up a small leather journal. He read the entry aloud. "Gave the letter and mother's pearls to Elise to deliver to Lauren. I hope my brave girl knows how proud I am of her." His voice broke on the last words. "Lauren, your grandmother left you her most precious jewelry and a handwritten letter telling you how much she loved you. Elise never delivered them. I found the pearl necklace hidden in Elise's jewelry box. She has been wearing it for years, pretending she bought it herself. The letter, I believe she destroyed it." I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep from crying out. 5 years of grief. 5 years of believing my grandmother had forgotten me. 5 years of watching Elise wear those pearls and feeling that familiar ache of being the invisible daughter. It had all been a lie. Grandma Eleanor had loved me. She had left me her most treasured possession and her final words, and Elise had stolen them both. The video continued. Harold explained that when he discovered the truth about the pearls, he started investigating further. He hired a private investigator. He made contact with Detective Martinez, who was already building a case against Elise for identity theft. He wanted to gather all the evidence before confronting anyone. I tried to tell you, Lauren, he said, his eyes filled with regret. 2 months ago I called and asked about your financial troubles. I was trying to start the conversation, but you said everything was fine and I was a coward. I could not destroy your world over the phone. He wiped his eyes with a shaking hand. I also knew that if I warned you, you would confront Elise immediately. She would have time to destroy evidence, create alibis, manipulate your parents. I needed to build an airtight case first. I thought I had more time. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I ran out of time, Lauren, but I made sure the truth would reach you one way or another. Then his tone changed, becoming harder and more urgent. If you are watching this in a hospital, it means Elise has made her move. She knows I left you a sealed letter in my will. She will try to intercept it the same way she intercepted Eleanor's letter 5 years ago. Her plan will be simple. She will show up at the attorney's office with a forged document claiming you authorized her to receive your mail. After she gets the letter, she will tell you it was just a brief note, nothing important, or that it got lost in the confusion. I know this because it is exactly what she told you about Eleanor's letter. Grandmother was not sentimental. That was a lie, Lauren. Eleanor loved you more than anyone in this family ever understood. The video ended and I sat in silence for a long moment, letting the truth settle into my bones. My grandfather had seen everything. He had prepared for everything. And now I was going to walk into that will reading armed with knowledge that no one expected me to have. I arrived at the attorney's office at 5 minutes before 10. Detective Martinez met me in the parking lot with a small velvet box. Inside were my grandmother's pearls recovered from Elise's home that very morning as evidence. I fastened them around my neck and walked through the front door. The conference room fell completely silent when I appeared. My parents sat on one side of the long table, my sister on the other. Elise's face went pale the moment she saw the pearls against my skin. She recognized them instantly. She knew exactly what their presence meant. I said nothing. I simply took my seat and waited. The attorney read the will. 70% of my grandfather's estate was left to me. He had included a written explanation. This is not favoritism, he wrote. This is compensation for what was stolen from my granddaughter and recognition of a character that remained kind despite receiving no kindness from her own family. My mother made a small sound of disbelief. My father stared at the table. Elise's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. When the reading concluded, Elise stood abruptly and announced she needed fresh air. She grabbed her designer purse and headed for the door, but Detective Martinez and 2 uniformed officers were waiting for her in the parking lot. I watched through the conference room window as they stopped her beside her luxury car, the one I now knew had been purchased with my stolen credit. Elise Price. Detective Martinez said in a clear voice, "You are under arrest for aggravated assault, federal identity theft of property, and forgery." During the search, an officer pulled a folded document from Elise's purse. It was a forged power of attorney, dated that very morning, authorizing Elise to receive all mail and legal documents on my behalf. The signature was a near-perfect copy of my handwriting. My grandfather had predicted her plan down to the last detail. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Elise locked eyes with our mother through the window. "Mom," she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "Tell them I was helping you. Tell them you knew." My mother's face drained of all color. She said nothing. She did not move. Inside the conference room, Detective Martinez made a note in her small black book. I turned to the detective with a question that had been building in my chest since the moment Elise screamed those words. What exactly did my mother know? Detective Martinez looked at me with steady eyes. "That is our next conversation, Miss Price." That conversation happened sooner than I expected. Detective Martinez stepped back into the conference room less than 10 minutes after Elise was taken away in handcuffs. My parents were still sitting at the table, my mother gripping the armrests of her chair like she might float away if she let go, my father staring at the wood grain as if it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. The detective closed the door behind her and addressed my mother directly. "Mrs. Price," she said, "we have evidence that you became aware of the identity theft 3 years ago and took active steps to conceal it." My mother's head snapped up. "That is ridiculous," she said, her voice climbing higher. "I had no idea what Elise was doing. I am as shocked as anyone." Detective Martinez opened a folder and spread several documents across the table. Bank statements showing monthly transfers from my mother's account to Elise's amounts that exactly matched the minimum payments on the fraudulent credit accounts. Those payments had kept the accounts from going to collections, which would have triggered alerts that might have reached me. There were also printed text messages, conversations between my mother and Elise discussing how to respond if I ever questioned my credit problems. Tell her it is probably just a mistake at the bank, my mother had written. These things happen all the time. Act sympathetic, but do not offer to help her look into it. The final piece of evidence was a deleted email that the investigators had recovered from Elise's computer. My mother had written it 2 years ago. Just make sure she never finds out the email read, "I cannot lose you too." My mother opened her mouth to deny it again, but I pulled out my phone and pressed play on my grandfather's video. His voice filled the conference room, calm and deliberate, explaining exactly what he had discovered and when. He named dates. He cited bank records. He described the moment he found the text messages on Elise's phone while she thought he was napping. My mother listened, with her face growing paler by the second. When the video ended, she did not try to deny it anymore. Instead, she started to cry. "You do not understand what it was like," she said through her tears. "I was not ready to be a mother when I had Lauren. I was 22 years old. I had dreams. I wanted to travel to see the world to figure out who I was before I became someone's mother. But Harold, my own father, convinced me to keep the pregnancy. He said I would regret it forever if I did not." She looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, something between guilt and accusation. "I have spent 35 years feeling like my life was taken from me. And then you grew up so independent, Lauren, so self-sufficient. You never needed me for anything. You figured everything out on your own and never asked for help. But Elise needed me. Elise called me every day. Elise wanted my advice, my comfort, my presence. When I found out what she had done to you, I could not lose the only daughter who actually wanted me around. I sat very still as 35 years of coldness finally made sense. Every missed birthday call, every forgotten graduation, every holiday where my mother looked through me like I was made of glass. She had never bonded with me because she had never wanted me in the first place. And when she finally had a daughter who needed her, she chose to protect that daughter's crimes rather than protect me from them. My father had been silent through all of this, but now he spoke up. His voice was hoarse and confused. "What do you mean you knew for 3 years? What do you mean you helped her hide it?" Detective Martinez slid another document across the table. This was a loan application from 5 years ago, co-signed by my father. Elise had told him that I had already agreed to be a guarantor and just needed a family member as a co-signer for paperwork reasons. He had signed without questioning it, without calling me to confirm, without thinking twice. He had unknowingly helped his younger daughter commit fraud against his older daughter. He stared at the document with his name on it, then stared at his wife. "You knew about all of this. For 3 years you watched Lauren struggle and you said nothing." My mother's tears turned to anger. "You never cared enough to ask why Lauren's life was so hard," she snapped back at him. "You just assumed she was not as capable as Elise. You compared them constantly. You bragged about Elise's apartment and her car and her lifestyle while Lauren lived in that tiny house and drove that old sedan. It never occurred to you to wonder how your younger daughter afforded so much on her salary. It was easier to believe Lauren was the failure than to pay attention to what was actually happening." My father looked like he had been slapped. The two of them began arguing in harsh whispers, decades of suppressed resentments finally boiling over. The family facade that had been maintained for my entire life crumbled completely in that conference room, and I watched it happen with a strange sense of detachment. After a few minutes, I stood up slowly. I did not cry. I did not shout. I felt a calm settle over me that I had never experienced before. "For 8 years," I said, and my quiet voice cut through their arguing, "I thought I was a failure. Every closed door, every denied application, every landlord who looked at my credit report and told me no. I blamed myself. I thought I was doing something wrong that I could not identify." I paused and looked at each of them in turn. "But it was you, all of you, in different ways." I looked toward the window where Elise had been arrested. Elise stole my name, my credit, my future. She stole grandmother's letter and her pearls. For 5 years I thought I was forgotten by the woman who loved me most. I turned to my mother. "You discovered the theft and chose to protect the thief. Because I never needed you enough. Because I made the mistake of being self-sufficient. I looked at my father. And you never once asked why my life was so hard. You just assumed Elise was the successful one and I was the disappointment. It was easier than paying attention. Neither of them could meet my eyes. The attorney cleared his throat. There is one more item, he said. Mr. Harold recovered a copy of Eleanor's original letter from her personal attorney's files. Eleanor had kept a duplicate. He handed me a cream-colored envelope with my name written on it in my grandmother's elegant script. My hands trembled as I opened it. I read the letter aloud, so everyone in that room could hear what had been stolen from me. My brave girl, I know your life has not been easy. In that family, I have seen how they overlook you while praising your sister, but I have also seen how you keep your heart soft anyway. That takes more courage than they will ever understand. I am leaving you my mother's pearls. They were meant for the granddaughter who inherited my spirit, not just my blood. Wear them and remember, you were always enough. You were always loved. Your grandmother, Eleanor. For the first time that day, I let myself cry. Not from pain, but from finally being seen. My grandmother had known. She had watched and understood and loved me anyway. She had tried to tell me, and Elise had stolen those words. But now I had them. Now I knew the truth. My mother reached for my arm as I folded the letter carefully. Lauren, please, she said. You have to understand. I was young. I was overwhelmed. I made mistakes. I gently removed her hand from my arm. You did not make a mistake, Mom, I said. You made a choice. Every month for 3 years, you made the same choice. I picked up my purse and tucked the letter safely inside. I hope someday you understand the difference. I walked toward the door without looking back. In the lobby, Mrs. Patterson was waiting with a thermos of hot tea and a warm cardigan. Come on, dear, she said softly. Let me get you home. As I walked out with this woman I had known for only 2 years, I realized she had shown me more care in one morning than my mother had shown me in 35 years. 6 weeks later, I woke up in my grandfather's cottage to the sound of birds singing in the apple trees outside my window. It was the same sound that had greeted Harold and Eleanor every morning for 40 years, and now it greeted me. I lay there for a moment, feeling the soft cotton sheets against my skin, watching the early sunlight filter through the lace curtains that my grandmother had hung decades ago. For the first time in my adult life, I did not wake up with dread sitting heavy on my chest. There were no mysterious bills waiting in my mailbox, no credit rejections to brace myself for, no invisible force working against me that I could not name or understand. The weight I had carried for 8 years was finally gone. I got up and made coffee in the small kitchen where Eleanor used to bake apple pies every autumn. My credit had been fully restored. I learned that Grandfather Harold had secretly paid off all $187,000 of fraudulent debt before he died. He wanted my fresh start to be truly fresh, with no traces of Elise's crimes following me into my new life. I touched the pearl necklace at my throat as I waited for the coffee to brew. I wore it every single day now. It was my grandmother's most precious possession, meant for me all along, and I would never take it off. I had started a small bookkeeping practice from the cottage's sunroom, a bright space with windows on 3 sides that looked out over the orchard. 3 local clients had already signed on small businesses that needed someone trustworthy to manage their accounts. The work was steady and satisfying, and I could do it all from this place that felt more like home than anywhere I had ever lived. Every afternoon around 3 o'clock, Mrs. Patterson would walk over from her house next door with a plate of homemade cookies and a thermos of tea. We would sit on the porch and talk about nothing in particular, just easy conversation between 2 people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. She had become the family I chose, and I had become part of hers. Detective Martinez called me on a Thursday morning with final updates on all the cases. Elise was facing 18 to 25 years in federal prison. The charges were extensive. Identity theft, totaling $187,000 in fraud across state lines. Aggravated assault for the pills she gave me, which contained a compound specifically designed to trigger severe anaphylaxis. Theft of property for my grandmother's jewelry valued at $15,000, and forgery for the power of attorney document she had planned to use. My mother had been formally charged as an accessory after the fact for her 3 years of actively concealing a felony. She would not serve prison time due to her age and clean record, but she would have to testify against Elise at trial. She was also ordered to pay $50,000 in restitution and would carry a felony conviction for the rest of her life. My father, while not criminally charged, had filed for divorce and put the family home up for sale. He sent me a letter apologizing for his blindness, asking for nothing in return. I read it once and put it in a drawer. I was not ready to respond, and I was not sure I ever would be. One Saturday morning, I heard a car pull into my driveway. I looked out the window and saw both of my parents emerging from the same vehicle. It was the first time they had been in the same space since my father filed for divorce. They walked to my door together, and I knew immediately why they had come. I invited them inside, because that is the kind of person my grandmother raised me to be. I made tea and set out cookies that Mrs. Patterson had brought the day before. Then I sat across from them and listened to their complete plea. My mother cried as she spoke. Elise was facing almost 2 decades in prison. She was their daughter. She had made terrible mistakes, but she did not deserve to have her whole life taken away. My father looked hollowed out, a shadow of the man who used to sit at the head of our family table. He said that a letter from me requesting leniency could make a real difference at sentencing. The judge would take it seriously. It could mean the difference between 18 years and 12 or even less. They were asking me to help save my sister from the full consequences of what she had done to me. I let them finish. I did not interrupt or argue. When they were done, I set down my teacup and responded calmly. I spent 35 years wondering what I did wrong to make this family treat me like I was invisible. Now I know the answer. I did nothing wrong. You all made choices. Elise chose to steal from me not once, but systematically for 8 years. She chose to destroy my grandmother's letter and wear her pearls as if she had a right to them. She chose to poison me, so I would not make it to the will reading. Mom, you chose to help her hide all of it because she made you feel needed in a way I never did. Dad, you chose not to see what was happening because it was easier to assume I was the failure than to pay attention to the truth. I paused and looked at them both. I will not write that letter. Not because I want Elise to suffer. I do not want that. But consequences are how people learn that their actions have weight. Maybe 18 years will teach her what this family never did. And maybe watching her face those consequences will teach both of you something too. Neither of them spoke. After a long silence, they stood up and walked out of my cottage without another word. I watched their car disappear down the long driveway, and I felt nothing but peace. That night I sat in my grandfather's reading chair with Eleanor's letter in my hands. I had read it dozens of times by now, but tonight felt different. I was not reading it as a revelation anymore. I was reading it as a foundation, a permanent part of who I was and who I would become. I found a beautiful wooden frame at an antique shop in town and placed the letter inside. I hung it on the living room wall beside the photographs of Harold and Eleanor that had been there for decades. My real family. The ones who fought for me, even after they were gone. Beneath the photos, I placed a small card with words I had written myself. Family is not who you are born to. It is who chooses you and who you choose back. A month later, early autumn arrived, and the apple trees in the orchard were heavy with fruit. I sat on the cottage porch at sunset with a cup of tea, cooling in my hands, watching the sky turn gold and rose above the Indiana fields. Mrs. Patterson waved from her garden next door, where she was teaching her granddaughter how to plant tulip bulbs for spring. I waved back with a smile that came easily now. I touched the pearl necklace at my throat, the one my grandmother left me 5 years ago, the one I finally received 6 weeks ago, the one I would wear for the rest of my life. I got your letter, grandmother, I said softly to the evening air. I know you never forgot me. I know you saw me when no one else did. A breeze stirred the apple trees, and somewhere nearby a wind chime that Harold had hung decades ago played 3 soft notes. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. Family is not blood, I whispered. Family is who fights to stay in your life, and who fights for you even after they are gone. I opened my eyes to the sunset. This is just the beginning, I said, of the life I should have had all along. I picked up my tea and went inside to start dinner, leaving the porch light on, just in case Mrs. Patterson wanted to stop by later. The cottage glowed warmly against the darkening Indiana sky, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I belonged. Lauren's story teaches us something that too many of us learn too late. The people who hurt us the most are often the ones we trust completely. But here is the truth that matters. You are not responsible for the choices other people make, even when those people are family. If someone in your life is making you feel small, invisible, or worthless, that says everything about them and nothing about you. Real family does not tear you down in secret while smiling to your face. Real family shows up with a thermos of tea when your world falls apart. Sometimes the family we choose loves us better than the family we were born into, and that is okay. You deserve people who see you, who fight for you, who celebrate your strength instead of punishing you for it. Never let anyone make you believe you are less than you are. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss another powerful story like this one. And I would love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was secretly working against you? How did you find the strength to walk away? Share your story below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.